Hello, and welcome to a sixth video in my series on leftism and climate change. My name is Max Reynolds, and I'm the author of The Revolutionary Renaissance, a study on the dialectical evolution of totalitarian thought. For more of my work, you can visit my website at maxoreynolds.com, and I put out content regularly on YouTube and on Twitter. In the last lecture, we looked at some of the ideas of Murray Bookchin, who's a key thinker in the dialectical tradition. Once again, he goes back to some original Marxist ideas and is emphasizing the union of humanity to nature. So he's advocating a return to nature, a kind of a new social contract based on this, but it's going to be much more anarchic in flavor. So this is the left's idea of moving beyond states, some principle which is attempting to kind of capture some freedom. Obviously, in Marx's own system, this moving beyond the states was the ideal, but of course the catch point in Marx's system is that if you're going to forcibly remold people's consciousness, people's behaviour, the knowledge that people need to make the decisions in their life, if you're going to impose significant top-down power, you need an entity in order to do that, and that takes the form of a government. So you can't easily, or it's impossible rather, to move from that state of being top-down power imposition of government towards a free left anarchism, because if you're forcibly attempting to reform human nature, you need to continually apply that force in order to sustain that new false equilibrium. Whereas if you take away that stimulus, obviously people will revert back to their norms, and you would have the usual kind of systems spring back up. Nonetheless, he advocates a number of important changes. He's got the idea, he's starting to develop the ideas of holism, and he makes the important comment about bolting technological development into the ecological movement. So these are some quite important developments, particularly because the latter will subdue technology and technological development to environmental goals and to environmental principles. We'll see that parsed out obviously through Barry Commoner, his ideas, but also it begins to establish the idea and the premise that technological development should be made in order to basically move society to the leftward. So ideally, in order to exert that control, you would have the revolutionary society, the communists, the socialists, take control of certain institutions, whether be it financial or technological institutions in key places, and to begin to do the innovation, but bolting it into the moral systems associated with environmentalism. We also looked at Barry Commoner's speech, so he was emphasising, again, a recapitulation of Otto Ruler, his conception of the proletarian child. So this is, I think, something that should be quite intuitive at this point. The proletarian child is the person who is a child, but the benefit of being a child is that they haven't had their consciousness, from the Marxist perspective, polluted by the ideas of the old society. And so what you'll commonly find with communists is placing people who do not necessarily have technological competence in a certain area into positions of authority, and it's because they have a different kind of moral and social consciousness which has elevated them into a hierarchy. So the normal hierarchy that you would have of competence and ability to do a job within a company is replaced with social competence. So it's the exchange of the technical for the political. We also see Gaylord Nelson's speech, so Earth Day. So again, that was Lenin's birthday. We saw the flag, which was an important indicator of some of the more kind of holistic approach and ideas that's backing the Earth movement. You know, it's global, it's worldwide, everyone's integrated. And then we also saw some of the principles beginning to emerge more concretely of subduing trade, private property, the legislature and the legislation itself to ecological principles. And all of these theses come together in Barry Commoner's later Ecology, where we're really emphasising a complete remodelling of the economic landscape globally. But the details of how this is worked out and implemented are scarce. That's not something which is uncommon when it comes to academics. It's high level, universal, but particularities, of course, not necessarily always eked out. And that's obviously because physically eking out those details about how you would implement such a system would require an immense imposition of power, and to state that openly can often turn people off, especially where they've got do-gooder motives but haven't necessarily looked too deeply into the morality and consequences of their actions when they associate with a particular issue, but are unconscious of the fact that that issue is one of the tentacles of a broader movement which has an organised philosophy, which has a goal which it's working towards. Okay, so we'll move forward. So number 6, we're going to look through some of the work of Caroline Merchant. She's interesting because this is a new thrust to the ecological movement, specifically the union of feminism with ecology, and this begins in seemingly a more kind of literary form of the way that symbolic representations of the feminine and of nature have been commonly used. They have an overlap. So that's a very interesting thesis. And then the other one is by Aaron Gare, and so he's looking at postmodernism and the ecological. So we've got two different kind of prongs here, but we can see how these are very different to the original ideas of, particularly Engels, I think, is probably more important in the development of some of the ideas around nature, but it's really Marx who obviously lays the groundwork for the new dialectical divinity being the subject-object union of humanity with nature. So in Aaron Gare, we see an interesting idea, which is a more kind of nationalist or willingness to work with nationalities for a given period of time in order to reach ecological postmodernist goals. And we'll see more emphasis on things like narratives and language and the way, even sentences and essentially all the bedrock of propaganda. So part 1 is ecofeminism. So Caroline Merchant has quite a clear project which she's laying out, and one of the interesting things that's being drawn on is, almost in a Sartrean sense, the representation in literature and symbology of the feminine, and how nature is essentially positioned as a feminine entity. And there's quite a lot of metaphors, certainly in the English language, which they're either words which can represent different things in different situations depending on how they're used, but also which have symbolic meaning. So it's kind of things like the earth, the womb, a cave, the ploughed field, fecundity. All of these things, they refer to these things in which something might be seeded and is grown. So it's a place of transmutation, of transformation. And alongside these metaphors of seasons, change, transformation, growth, there's also the more kind of negative aspects of nature. So that's the decaying, the death, as part of a cycle of rebirth. The sun sets, the sun comes back up, so on and so forth. But also the violent, the wild, the unruly witch, the harpies, things like this. These mythical creatures, they represent a certain kind of person or personality or aspect of nature which is attempting to be brought forth. So the quote is, "The ancient identity of nature as a nurturing mother links woman's history with the history of the environment and ecological change. Reawakened interest in the values and concepts associated historically with the pre-modern organic world." So the interesting thing here is, of course, the idea of women's history and a history of the environment. So instantly that should be triggering the ideas of historicism in your mind, and now kind of referring back to an almost Sartrean sense where you have these multiple dialectics of every aspect of the world which are running in tandem with one another. And what's being begun to be established here is the idea that there's a reflection between women's history and the history of the environment. So there's this parallel between them. They're already connected linguistically, symbolically in a certain sense. So there's language which surrounds them, which connects them. And the language is mutually reflective. So the language bifurcates, I could perhaps say. So that's the, depending on what context you're using the word, it can refer to the two things. But there's also this third position and problem, which in the feminist world is the masculine. And what's being referenced, what's being alluded to, is how the masculine, through systems of hierarchy and judicial, whatever it happens to be, oppresses the feminine and likewise oppresses nature. So you recall that in the system of this dialectical system of logic, contradiction's an issue, and so what's kind of being alluded to is there's a certain non-contradiction of sorts latent between nature and woman, but the thing which sustains a contradiction would obviously be the masculine system, the formal logic, so on and so forth. And so likewise, the man will, as they view it, oppress woman, but will likewise oppress nature because they are reflections of one another. So man will forcibly sustain the contradictions, and through the process of essentially antagonizing and sustaining power over nature and woman. So there's a reflection between the objectification of nature and the objectification of woman. And now there's also another way you can look at this. So if you were working backwards essentially from Marx's original ideas of uniting humanity with nature, or if you were working from the proletariat, you can apply the dialectical system to first pull out a contradiction and then say it's this front group or this front entity or this front concept, this new category that is going to be driven as the thin end of the wedge in order to reunite all of the things that are more associated with the other aspects of the surrounding categories, such as humanity as a whole, or the proletariat as a whole, or nature as a whole. And so here the proletariat is being split into its masculine and feminine, and it's specifically the feminine which is going to attempt to synthetically unite with nature, create a different consciousness, and then this can act back upon the men and then drag them up into the system of dialectical holism and increasing unity. So we must re-examine the formation of a worldview and a science that, by reconceptualizing reality as a machine rather than a living organism, sanction the domination of both nature and woman. Francis Bacon, William Harvey, René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes and Isaac Newton must be re-evaluated. So no small project, but we can see the parallel with Marx's original thinking because it's going right back to the fact that a certain form of logic, a certain form of perceiving the world around you, what things to attend to, what's important, what information is used in decision making, and really the moral kind of valence of every object and every action, and also that's read into every individual. This all needs to be reformed. That's completely characteristic of the dialectical mindset. It's a revolution not of one aspect of nature, not one aspect of people. It's all of reality that is reformed. So of course you're going to need to try and put the negative spin on every achievement, particularly of the groups that you dislike. So here we all have, there'll be white Western men. So those are characteristics that are disliked within the leftist tradition. So what you're going to need to do is now associate each of those individuals, their motives, the form of their work, their means of maintaining it within academic circles, but excluding perhaps the layman from their highly abstract frameworks, the way it's conveyed, the contents, the methodology of study, indeed the data analysis and their conclusions, their ideas, and then the way that they were used. All of these things need to now be reevaluated through the social lens, and need to be associated with power, dominion, hatred, loathing, and the domination of all who do not hold the socialist views. So you go through this process of dialectically reforming all of the contents around you, which act as barriers to the broader dialectical reformation, which is the ability to forcibly control other people's consciousness through things such as dialectical methodology, indoctrination, propaganda, so on and so forth, that would change people's minds on how to view the world. So through dialectical interaction, science and culture develop as an organic whole. So there's this relation which is obviously by the 1980s quite comprehensively established in neo-Marxist circles, which is that science and culture have a bearing on one another. You can see the parallels with Bookchin's ideas that science and culture have an interaction. So as science develops, the means or methods by which culture can be conveyed, the speed with which it can be conveyed, the kinds of things which can be conveyed can alter to a degree. So things like speed of information might drastically increase after electricity is developed, although ultimately, it's only the same kind of premises that have always been spoken or come up with by individuals, which are conveyed. And we can kind of see how, again, the interaction of science and culture, as far as the neo-Marxists would be concerned with it, is used to, well, they would frame it as being used to create this kind of pseudo-culture which occludes reality. And first you need to start teaching the logic, the new conceptualizations, recognizing yourself as a victim and seeing the victimhood in all of these different aspects of reality all throughout the structure, and then how this all needs to be changed. So you're looking at how science and culture is used and its contents and so on and so forth, and then that all of these need to be dialectically reformed as part of the revolution. So science itself needs to be taken control of. Then you can create scientific developments. They're already culturally, socialists and neo-Marxists are already very culturally sensitive, so they would have primed ideas to then put into whatever new scientific discoveries or technical innovations there are, in order to try and get ahead. So you drag society with you, and you negate the old, and you posit the new leftists' utopia, or whatever you want to call it. The key idea being that being nature is female, and naturally we have access now, and very easy access with the internet, to a complete wealth of information about different societies, different cultures at different points and in different locations, all throughout human history, how there have been different representations of women in different styles, in different forms, carved into different materials or painted, and so on and so forth. And that latent within these representations are, ethical norms and practices with those societies. So it's the kind of idea that the behaviours which people have are likewise reflected up into the artwork, and then the association between nature and feminine as represented in the artistic sphere. So it's really how the behaviours cascade all the way into the aesthetic, and then how the aesthetic also bolts into and represents the moral norms of said society. And there's a kind of pragmatic element, of course. In different cultures there's going to be slightly different representations and slightly different norms, so that might lead to different artistic expressions. And so there's a whole drawing in her study from animist sources, pagan sources, and Gnostic traditions. And it was interesting to see specifically the explicit statement of Gnostic traditions now in the neo-Marxist tradition. And that's because so much of the dialectical methodology, the idea of, you may have at this point, or I may have mentioned, thesis and antithesis are brought together and then create a synthesis. And this synthesis can become the new thesis, and a new antithesis generated to create a new synthesis. And so you've got this stepwise transformation that can take place. Of course, if you have a goal in mind, then you are creating the antithesis of the thing that you want to change in order to change it once you unite them together. So that's it's quite a Gnostic principle about the sexual union, and I'm using sexual in the sense of a creative union. So man and woman come together and produce a child. So there's a certain act, and through the act things are brought together, and then something is latent and is taken from both and preserved in the new being, in the child. And this is quite common, quite a common metaphor, I think, in literature, but certainly an important point in Gnostic ideas of transmuting from one substance to another, from lead to the gold. Or, for example, this kind of idea of which is latent in all of Marxism, is essentially that the world is false, it's inverted, your understanding is the opposite of what it ought to be. So you're essentially this kind of divine shard that's caked in mud, and your objective is to use the dialectical methodology, the historicism, revolutionary materialist action to rip away that kind of mud that's around the shard, and by cleaning off this shard, you reveal the truth. And so it's this, you're ripping off the mud of your identity and then revealing some kind of true aspect. So here we actually see that's essentially the inversion of Christianity that is Marx's system. So there's the positive and the negative aspects. Mother and bride, whose primary function was to comfort, nurture and provide for the well-being of the male. So again, this is taking a very specific approach, even to looking at the information. It's not the fact that the best way that you can split up what limited resources you have in the family between all of the tasks that you need to do is that, okay, the mother bears the child, brings the child into this world, and then produces the food which the baby will drink, so it can grow strength until it can have solid food. It is natural for the mother and baby to be paired with one another. Likewise, she can recognize threats. She can tell her spouse what is needed, what kind of things are needed, and then he is the one who can take the risk, go out into the wild, likely with other males, and try and gain resources to bring back to support the family and the mother and ultimately the child. So that's the positive view, whereas the negative view from the Marxist angle is that this is all a system of exploitation and oppression. The father accrues wealth in order to purchase the woman so he can bring children into the into the world, and then exploit their own labour before he dies, and then passes some on and sustains this entire horrendous perpetual system of exploitation. So again, there's this kind of, you see the thin end of the wedge, that it's the nurturing for, the being made to provide for the well-being of the male. It's this kind of servantesque interpretation of the feminine being used for just someone who's just for pleasure. There's this kind of rejection of the inherent worth of the woman in this system from this point of view. So ultimately, when we come to the interaction of masculine and feminine, just as we come to the interaction of capitalism and nature, there is this creative principle of transmuting one substance into another. So that's latent in the thesis, antithesis, creating synthesis. It's the sexual union of opposites. As a creative function, it's the creative principle. That can be moved in the negative direction, like we see. It's the anti-praxis. It's the dialectic being trapped in a little eddy, as Sartre would have said. Or it can progress in the right direction with materialism, so on and so forth. So the living earth in her wisdom has ordained against the mining of metals by concealing them within the depths of her womb. Gold contributed to human corruption, avarice, iron, war. And so the idea here is that there are minerals hidden below the surface, and by advancing the number of resources or the methodologies by which we accrue material resources, we're plundering something that should remain hidden. So there's something which shouldn't be revealed, because when it is revealed, it causes us to accumulate all this mud around the divine shard, which is the complete ideal, the perfected individual, the perfected society, the perfected consciousness, the perfected knowledge of reality, the perfect practice, and so on and so forth. So there's this idea really of feminine nature being a kind of a self-reflective entity, and having recognised now the mutual oppression of both of these entities, to try and fix the relationship on the other side. So the idea of capitalist exploitation of nature is the parallel of the masculine oppression of woman. Of course, both are capitalism and the masculine oppression of woman. So that would be the system of monogamy, recall from Engels. Those are both driven by men. They're interlinked with one another. So by breaking apart monogamy, we're likewise going to start to see a different kind of means of people coming together, and the way that they have, they're going to have a very different kind of family now. It's not going to be a Christian family. It's going to be a secular family, ultimately it's going to be a communist family. And a communist family, really the biological connections between the two, the normal father-child or husband and wife relationship is fractured. It's a perversion of what it ought to be, and often you could see that in Soviet Russia when they informed on one another and would send their spouse to the gulag or whatever. So you're going to completely change the form of the family, and likewise changing this form of the family into one in which the society is the family is likewise going to make it easier to install different ideas through the state into the mind of the child, which reforms their conception of the relationship between man and woman, man and nature, woman and nature, so on and so forth, and then obviously continues to change consciousness and society. So a slow but unidirectional alienation from the immediate daily organic relationship that had formed the basis of human experience from earliest times was occurring. And so again, this is just a recapitulation of the ideas that Marx has already developed. It's the historicist development over time, but there was this this seed which was essentially the correct relationship, but it's the masculine and the capitalism which have both polluted this with this relationship. So the use of the earth is synonymous with the abuse of the earth, and you can see how that parallels the idea that the woman is used by the man in the relationship, and so the objective is to get woman ahead, in the sense of technological and cultural creation, and then to use a specific indoctrination of ideas into woman, of a more holistic union with nature, to in turn reform the rest of society. So in the Marxist system, you always want to negate the way things are as they currently are, and then that mediates a number of changes elsewhere, and then you move into a new form of society, you posit a new future, and then eventually once you take that dialectical step forward into the next epoch, you negate your current epoch and move forward again and again and again, because the dialectic is just a continuous process. So the issue really is that there's a state of contradiction in existence, and there's a requirement for a new partnership between humans and the earth is urgently needed. So that's also a recapitulation of Marx's original ideas. So it's ultimately it's a reference to not even I think a partnership is, maybe she didn't understand Marx's key and core ideas deeply enough, because a partnership is kind of recognizes two separate entities still. You could maybe argue dialectically that's in an earlier phase, but it would make more sense if we're going back to the original kind of Marxist idea, which is at the end of this system, whether she knows it or not, is a union between humans and Earth. It's got to be more than just a partnership. They actually have to become one entity, although represented dualistically. So nature, culture, and knowledge need to be brought into harmony with one another. So again, this is nothing different from what we've already seen. I use knowledge with a Gnostic kind of sense, so the idea that you can actually you can use the dialectical method to come to something that you think is absolute truth about reality and a new form of reality, or this unique knowledge, which it paints a picture of the future into which you're meant to be marched. Of course, if you're not going to be marching, then you're put in the ground. And then there's the constant reform of the knowledge. So it's not just one step you take; it's a constant series of steps that you take. So the knowledge is always being reformed in order to try and create greater holistic integration. And then you obviously get the subject-object union at the end of time. So technology and population is a key one, and that's already a theme which we've seen in Bookchin and Commoner. A rejection of the objectification of nature and women requires the usurpation of capitalism masculinity. That's one of the key things to really take away, is that the two are seen as connected with one another. If you can depose man, then you can also likewise depose capitalism. Realistically, it's the use of state power and force and indoctrination, the control of perceptions, in order to create the shibboleth of the patriarchy, which is associated with horror and fear and persecution, which then needs to be negated, and then you posit a higher, more perfect and ideal society, which is of course the feminine society, and the non-capitalist, so obviously more towards a communist society. So there's a reinvigoration of organicism / holistic frameworks is required. So just one comment there. Organicism, that's when things are stuck in a crude, non-dialectical or pre-dialectical understanding of the world. You're wanting to move beyond that into the holistic, dialectical, historicist understanding. That requires a kind of vitalism. So again, we're referencing Canguilhem. Indeed, in Caroline Merchant's work, there's a section which is essentially a recapitulation of Georges Canguilhem's work, speaking about René Descartes and his mechanist view of the world, and needing to replace it with the holistic, organic, the vitalism. Of course, when it comes to neo-Marxists, they don't tend to cite clearly. I can't remember if I've mentioned this in one of the videos already, but the paper trail is sometimes difficult to trace. You can only know it by having read the arguments in the two authors who are making the same argument, so you got to do the reading. But if you do the reading of Canguilhem, you can see that Caroline Merchant's argument on René Descartes is a recapitulation of the exact same argument, but without the citations to Georges Canguilhem. So they just pop up kind of like moles in different places, and it's only kind of by having seen one mole that you recognise the other ugly mole, and know that they're connected. So criticism is explicitly against the analytical form of reason. Again, same system, same ideas, banging the old same drum. It's pretty straightforward once you've got the core ideas. It just happens to be which particular area they're being applied, which kind of creative and horrendous goal they happen to have in mind, or which kind of aspect of people's empathetic impulses and ideas are going to be taken advantage of to try and integrate people and bolt people into a system which is far more comprehensive but kept occluded from the individual as when we're thinking about the whole level. So keeping the task focus. I have a specific issue I'm upset about and I want to do blah 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 to help group X, but this blah 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 to help group X is underpinned by dialectical methodology and is bolted into a larger framework, but this connection between the two is kept occluded, and that's an advantage obviously if you're trying to manipulate other people. So we're going to move back to Murray Bookchin. One of the interesting things from the 1980s to the 1990s is it really is the feminists who make a lot of the advancements in terms of the ideas that are developed, the new dialectical ideas, the new approaches which are going to be made, the new concepts that are going to be laid down in various ecofeminist studies courses or gender studies courses, women studies courses, yada yada yada, about how to change people's consciousness and how to reconceptualize the world and the influence that has on morals. So it's this time that you'll have ecofeminism develop, but it's also where you have all of things like queer studies and all the gender identity stuff. Those ideas start to be developed and then put into practice in courses, and then new and later stages. So a lot of the issues we have today are essentially, you can see their roots at this period of time. So Bookchin praises the developments of the feminists. So ecology raises the issue that the very notion of man's domination of nature stems from man's domination of man. Feminism reaches even further and reveals that the domination of man by man actually originates in the domination of man by woman by man. So of course there's the going straight back to the root of some of Marx and Engels' ideas, which are that the practices which are established and extant in the family are taught again to the children through this becomes the system of ideology, but it reperpetuates the system of the fetishism of seeing objects as distinct in order to imbue them with a kind of spiritual power, forcing people to desire private property, which induces them to partake in the system of labour, the division of labour, differential accrual of private property, so on and so forth. So again, domination cascades and is a consequence of the inequitable relationship between man and woman in marriage. Of course, this is only just a very specific framing of that relationship when you view as essentially women as objects who are purchased, which is latent within the Marxist position. That's the conceptualization of the family. So they're an object that was essentially purchased for pleasure and for creating new slaves to the system of private property. So we must either choose between ecology with its naturalism, its anarchistic logic of decentralization, its emphasis on humanely scaled alternate technologies, and its non-hierarchical institutions, or socialism with its typically Marxian anti-naturalism, its political logic of centralization, its emphasis on high technology, and its bureaucratic institutions. So if we go back to Marx's core idea, which is that communism established, you then need to strive to establish socialism, part of socialism being the collective realization in consciousness of the unity of humanity and nature, and as the materialization of divinity, which takes from itself, for itself, creates itself, so on and so forth in this Eurobric fashion. But the criticism that's being made is that the Marxist approach places too much emphasis on one of the categories, and that's the human aspect. There's not the same kind of development of the naturalist aspect, and Bookchin's tuning into the fact that the ecofeminists are really developing the ecological aspect. And of course, if you can transform the way that people's representation of nature in consciousness, this can in turn is a change in the milieu, and then it can be used to act back upon humanity, at which point then it can be reintegrated with one another. So it's perhaps an argument about which way, the way in which certain steps are taken in order to affect the final goal, although necessarily the final goal can also take a different can take a different form, or it doesn't necessarily need to be beholden to a strict Marxist endpoint at this time now, because there's been so much development since and so much criticism of Marx and his original philosophy, although they are perennially indebted to it and to him and to Engels and his contributions as well. So it's this idea of naturalism as non-hierarchical is odd, because I think in pretty much every kind of animal herd or type of species, there's always going to be that kind of relationship. So it's the inability to really penetrate what's actually happening in reality, and then making your conceptual ideas and transformations therefrom. So nature is not non-hierarchical, but that doesn't faze them. Anyway, effort is to the critical thrust in the hope that we may yet recast the ecological community and theoretical issues of our time in a revolutionary direction. And again, this is the direct use of nature and environmentalism, of what's going on in ecology, the information that's coming out about things like waste, pollution and other issues, how these can all be turned in the revolutionary direction. So, like I've said earlier, I'm not interested in whatever particular aspect of a scientific paper or piece of literature is stating on the concentration of methane in the atmosphere, or how many CFCs were released in 1982, or whatever it happened to be. I'm more interested in how that information is used in order to mold people's perceptions and the things that are emotive, which they then attend to, which have a bearing on what they see as right conduct, which in turn influences their behaviour. So this is really what the neo-Marxists, post-structuralists are up to, which is how can we take this information and then use it to and mate it dialectically into the revolutionary effort, and then see what new kind of dialectical creations are going to come out, but also the new kind of implications for consciousness and how we'll need to reform people's behaviour, and then the consciousness again, so on and so forth. And here it's quite clearly saying, well, instead of necessarily having a ruthless kind of economic focus like a Puritan Marxist would, it would be to focus on the environmental. And I think it's a much more potent argument, because there's a kind of a distant threat aspect, so it tunes into the victimhood bit. There's also a bit of a question mark about whether you know, it's really going to go this way or it's really going to go that way. You know, most people play it safe, might likely go to the, okay, let's curb all of these various different behaviors of production or ownership and things like this, and implement this system of top-down control to obtain the certain goals of avoiding the anti-utopian end is nigh, death, destruction, yada yada yada. But the problem, obviously, that people can stumble into is that issue of, okay, well, what about when you're looking at a specific issue, but you haven't stepped back to recognize, okay, well, who is it that's pushing this issue? What is it they benefit from it? What is the system put in place in order to prevent this issue from coming to fruition? And then realizing that it's a massive top-down imposition of institutional power with the use of technology, but which has significant moral consequences for people's ability to speak freely and for people to act freely in the world. And of course, once you start to implement that system of removing the ability to speak in conformance with what occurs in reality, you mitigate and reduce the ability to then also conduct yourself in accordance with what reality demands of you. And that's the point where things just shatter completely when you're making use of the Marxist system, is when you detach from reality, and then you're expected to play the political game, which is detached from reality, even though everyone can see that 2 + 2 = 4, everyone shouts 5, although at a later date they might go back and say, well, we need to start shouting 4 now because too many people have been killed this time around. So unsurprisingly, we see the idea that utopia has become a necessity. So this is kind of, in my view, alluding back to Sartre's ideas. It's utopia is, again, this idea that there's the possibility of humanity having the kind of correct consciousness in its interaction with nature acting essentially unmediated back on people's consciousness, and the species being in the world and being being a collective entity, the world with the species being a collective entity, but recognizing that this entity is a necessity, and necessity is part of this motivational driver, is that we must have this endpoint, we must still strive for utopia. That presupposes that A, it's possible, and B, that actions can be taken in order to create it. And of course, once you go back into this mode of thinking, then you've got the top-down imposition of power to obtain an unobtainable goal. And so what you have is force needlessly applied to an immense number of people, creating an immense amount of suffering. If only the academics here had really kind of thought things through a bit more properly, then you wouldn't have that issue. But this is one of the courses for civilization to annihilate itself through academic developments which aren't rooted in reality, and which also make it a moral injunction that you're not allowed to apprehend reality, not to speak true to reality, not to act in conformance with reality. So my emphasis on achieving a new totality between humanity and nature is part of a larger endeavour to transcend all the divisions on which hierarchy has been reared for centuries. So again, there shouldn't really be anything new here, pretty straightforward. So one of the interesting things, however, is that there's a speculative eye of history, and the third subject, which breaks from the alienation and governs the understanding of the path forward. So you recall back in Marxist system, you've got the whole historicist progression towards the end of history. So here again we see Bookchin recapitulating humanity united with nature, and the humanity united with nature is the third subject. So you're supposed to be able to try and put yourself into this consciousness and then to look back at yourself in the present day. So it's kind of like a metacognitive action. You're looking at yourself, you're sitting yourself in the third person, looking back at yourself, you're reflecting on yourself and seeing, what do I need to do to reform my being in conformance of what it needs to be at the end of history for this third subject? What do I also need to reform around me? What actions need to be taken? So on and so forth. So that's the recapitulation of the regulator of your virtues and your actions at the end of history, but populated by the Marxist entity. You mate yourself with that and then you move towards it. So Marx was to fall victim to this historic subterfuge by ignoring the subsurface modes of obedience and command that lie in the family, school, bureaucracy and age structure, or more precisely by identifying the social problem with class relations at the expense of a searching investigation into the hierarchical relations that produced class forms in the first place. Indeed, Marxism may well be the ideology of capitalism par excellence, precisely because the essentials of its critique have focused on capitalist production without challenging the underlying cultural sensibilities that sustain it. This is quite an interesting critique of Marx. So it's not the first time that this critique has been made. Lukács made it, I think it was back in the 1909 History and Class Consciousness, I think, which may have been about 1919, 1920. You also see it in multiple other neo-Marxist scholars. The reason that Marxism blew up and murdered a spectacular number of people, which no other system has managed to kill in such a short amount of time, is because it was actually infested by the bourgeois and their ideological ideas and capitalism. So that's how you get this ridiculous idea that Marxism may be the ideology of capitalism par excellence being stated. With that you manage to lazily dissociate Marxism from being the murderous system that it is, which makes use of human sacrifice when you're pulling off that mud. You get the shard. That's you on an individual level. If you can imagine it on a collective level, well, you've got to dispense and wash away with the mud in order to get the pure collective. That's the principle of collective transcendence, transcending others. But you have to destroy them because of the victimhood and the violence aspect and the oppression aspect. So it's baked in at a fundamental level. But because they can't be honest about it, perhaps because the moral problem of how something which appears good and sounds good is turned to evil ends is a complex one. But I think if you hadn't stepped back and really tried to understand the nuts and bolts of how something which is meant to sound like it's good and be kind to people and how it goes horribly wrong, you've essentially, if you're an academic, you've completely failed in your vocation. But nonetheless, we see multiple examples, whether it's Lukács, whether it's Bookchin, whether it's Freire, a host of other people, all making the same kind of claims as well. Actually, Marx's philosophy was already pre-corrupted because he hadn't understood that the contradictions ran deeper, and so here he's making the argument that Marx hadn't really taken account of the cultural problem, and then how the cultural problem had a bearing on how nature and the interaction with nature was reflected up into culture. How the practical material relation with nature existed and then was reflected up into consciousness and reflected into culture. I think this is a poor argument, purely because if we look at Marx's context, he was arguing to use atheism to negate the belief in God. That's an intermediary step, and then after that you have humanity united with nature, which is your new form of materialist God. So you've got this stepping stone of going from belief in transcendent God to essentially you yourself are a fragment, a shard of this divine through the collective. How does that not involve a massive cultural transformation if you're going from, attending church, ritual, worship, prayer, having a certain moral conception of the world, having a certain way that you conduct yourselves, what things you find beautiful. The cultural thesis is just simply latent in Marx. Marx's was at a high enough level of abstraction and universality that the cultural critique is baked in. I mean, that was what occurred when you destroy the church to then replace it with Marx's system. And so I don't think that this argument holds much stock, to be honest. Ecology and post-structuralism. So a quick recap. What we see among the post-structuralists, and we're talking primarily about Foucault and Derrida as the founders of post-structuralism. The roots in the neo-Marxist use of post-structuralism can all be found in Gramsci's prison notebooks. Of course, the real father of post-structuralism is attributed correctly to Nietzsche. And so if we're moving in the opposite direction, one of the things which takes place in the 20th century is the union of primarily Nietzsche's influence into Marxist philosophy. And there are some very there are some very subtle aspects which are common between some of Nietzsche's thought and some of Marx's thought, and some of the stylistic and methodological approach which complements one another. Those are in my book, The Revolutionary Renaissance, in I think part 3, so you can get them there. But as it manifests in post-structuralism, there's really a rejection of reason, maths and science. That's different from Nietzsche's interpretation. Nietzsche, if something was being done automatically by yourself, as if you were kind of burying yourself in your work to avoid your nature and the things that you could potentially achieve and the experience of your power, then he would say that, you know, that form of reason, maths and science is actually a problem because it rules you. What you need to be is you need to be the driver in the seat of your car that and drive, you know, oriented towards your goals. So if you're doing that consciously and with will to power, then that's positive. You know, that's permissible, at least in Nietzsche's system. So there's a subtle distinction here where we're saying that through the will to power it's acceptable. Here the shift is a bit more subtle. It's more kind of neo-Marxist in fashion, but very different from what we traditionally understand as Marxism, because it's attacking things like knowledge, the idea of truth, the idea of validity, the very words that are used to represent concepts, the meaning which is associated with words. These are all going to be changed significantly, but not quite in the way that it's a very specific reading of Nietzsche which is used. Likewise, there's a rejection of meta-narratives. Again, if one situates this in a dialectical framework, particularly with post-structuralism, you could say that there is a certain set of relations to reality, and these are reflected up into consciousness, into society, so on and so forth, institutions. So there's a whole structure which is erected on top of material relations, and then one of the places in which that's reflected is in narratives, in the spoken word, in the conceptual frameworks and things like this. So post-structuralism can also be to break the meta-narratives, and you could deny that there is any meta-narrative such as, you know, capitalism or Marxism as being a meta-narrative. So you deny the meta-narratives, or maybe you take an alternative dialectical direction and you say all we were doing was narrating it, so you negate the narrative, and then you say, well, you need to implement a practical reality, so you need to take part in revolutionary action. So you can always take the dialectic different ways, of course. So there's obviously a lot of insights into the place where praxis and revolutionary behaviour can be manifested. Deleuze and Guattari also developed this idea of rhizome, which is, you know, you've kind of got this universal principle, but it has all these knobbly, weird outgrowths in different directions, which are the particularities to which it's applied. And you also have generally a rejection of objective truth, realism. Of course, if you're wanting to try and manipulate people, if you're wanting to try and apply force and get other people to take part in the system of applying force to others, then you're going to need to distort the perception of the truth, what's perceived as real, what's seen as moral, social consequences, and so on and so forth, because they stand in the way. Everything needs to be, as Lenin said, subjected to the goals of the revolution. Morality is, you know, whatever makes it happen. It's all goal-oriented. But one of the interesting things about post-structuralism, and it's a subtle read through their works, but dialectical reason is definitely preserved. Some say it more explicitly than others. I mean, it's obviously clear in Sartre. Sartre is a major influence on Foucault. Foucault does actually maintain it. That's his historicism, his history of sexuality, his archaeology of knowledge. These are all historicist studies, so obviously bolted into likewise making a dialectical use of a concept. But in a very certain way. You can look at other lectures for that. I won't go into it here. Materialism is preserved throughout all of them. Individualism is used, but it's individualism now in a neo-Rousseauian sense. So it's establishing a new social contract, and that new social contract can be, well, hey, we're not going to use the knowledge and the objective truth. We're going to make everything based on lived experience. So if I have a lived experience that the word racist now means social status plus power, then I'm going to ignore whatever's in the dictionary. We're going to start teaching it in schools, and yes, we'll leave the laws the same as what they are, but because people's comprehension of the word itself has changed, the function of the law is likewise changed in this new pragmatic atmosphere with a different kind of consciousness. So different kinds of people are now prosecuted for different kinds of actions, whilst the actual linguistics of the law itself can remain the same, but because you've altered key concepts, you change things. So yeah, sense of power, that's quite clear. Sense of meaning, power, and then goal orientation. So all the nuts and bolts are there. So one of the interesting things was Aaron Gair's Post-Modernism and the Environmental Crisis. This was a very useful book to go through because it's really trying to apply some of the core post-structuralist ideas to environmentalism. So we see the dialectical transformation now. It doesn't need to be the Marxist application to these ideas. It doesn't even need to be the ecofeminist form of environmentalism. Now this is the way that people talk about it, their ideas of social contract associated with it, the very sentences and words we use, the meaning of the concepts. Does it contain lived experience? Is it emotive? Does it emphasize the victimhood? All of these kind of things now start to boil up to the surface, and you can really see the kind of the sophistic aspect of the environmentalism. So globalization has led to an undermining of national identities and democratic authority. So that's recognised on the left. Of course, now if you can implement that deliberately, then you can further undermine national identities. This can be used to break down people's local and cultural allegiances and make that holistic end goal much more achievable. And so what this gives rise to is the new possibility of first it gives rise to an international bourgeoisie. So this is the globalist group of people who are doing whatever it is they're doing in business, making things global, big financial institutions, creating ever and ever larger businesses and entities which mutually own one another, and so on and so forth. And it also recognises that a general kind of loss of religion, which is alongside this. So we've got both the consolidation of the economic order globally, and likewise we have a loss of religion. Now, if you're thinking about this in the kind of the Marxist framework, then you're saying, okay, well, you're almost treating the world now as a state, which is more harmonious, at least in the way it behaves. So an international bourgeoisie gives rise to the possibility of an international proletariat. So that's a return to the original ideas of Marx in that sense. Very good because it is it's trying to do the same thing, but after removing several degrees of contradiction through different nation states, legislatures, cultures, and so on and so forth. And then there's also the loss of religion, which is of course important because at least within Marx's system, atheism is the intermediary stage before you go to the inverse and you essentially begin to worship yourself as manifested in the collective. So it recognises the effect of post-modernism getting into culture, and it's incredibly caustic. He sees it as isolating individuals. But I think he kind of missed that, at least as Derrida was positioning his post-structuralist developments in of grammatology, was it would allow, well, this breaking apart would be kind of an intermediary stage. It depends what level you conduct your analysis at. If you say that previously all people, if you make the assumption that all people previously subscribed to the idea that there is an objective truth that you can act in conformance to, then you can say, well, okay, everyone's acting within that category. But then the post-structuralist effort can come in and say, well, we're going to deny all objective truth. So instantly in that creation, you with people subscribing to it, you would split the number of people in one category, and then you would parse and pull out of them people into a different dialectical category. So it's at a certain level of analysis that you can recognize there is the creation of a new mindset, a new consciousness, a new way of looking at the world, which is in contradiction with the former. And that's important for recognizing that it's on a certain level analysis that, okay, you can look at it and say that all of the individuals are isolated from one another, but all of those individuals who are taking part in the post-structuralist revolution, which reject objective truth and facts and all these kind of things which are needed for a stable and society which is not completely insane, they're actually their own entity. They are a collective which are warring against the those who believe in it or who assert that there is an objective reality, and not one which is kind of mentalist and consciousness first and just completely arbitrary. So whilst there is all those contradictions within that group, they are fundamentally as an entity in contradiction with the old order, and it's that aspect that you probably need to focus on, because once you've got the background that the underlying form of reason is ultimately dialectical, it's that antagonism between the two which unites the people in the new group. It's why they've been created in the first place. So there's unity in praxis, even where the community itself is kind of schizotypal, and their praxis is that they exist in contradiction with the former. So he's provided a new route to exploitation through meaning and liberation in consumerism. So this is one of the problems of making everything kind of completely arbitrary, is that many things kind of lose a sense of meaning, or kind of Nietzsche's argument that once everything becomes completely arbitrary for interpretation, there is no kind of inherent value, and if you take these on a certain level of abstraction and put them against one another, it's nihilistic, because nothing actually ultimately has any value. It's all reinterpretable. But the point being that this post-structuralism can be sucked into the capitalist system and then used to yet further abuse people. So for example, you could I don't know, you might watch some video and then come up with your own complete meaning, or you might develop a product which is supposed to tap into somebody's sense of meaning. I mean, ironically, that's actually a really good summation of what post-structuralism does. It's trying to get you to it's a methodology which allows you to just go into various different things and then to rip them apart and just make it your own. So it's very indulgent, it's very hedonistic, it's getting you to that there's nothing outside of yourself which is kind of, it stands alone, and it's this kind of hard object which you come up against, and that has implications for you. Everything is soft and reformable, it's all me. But of course capitalism or unscrupulous businessmen can use that same thing to manipulate people and try and get people to establish a certain sense of meaning, personal meaning, with their products or with their company, and then use that to further abuse and control the people. So there's an issue of division between also what the media present and what journals say when it comes to the environmental crisis. So you've got this globalization, the change in morality, the establishment of an international bourgeoisie, the possibility of an international proletariat, now the disintegration of the senses of meaning, so people in isolated communities, or isolated ultimately as individuals. However, there is a certain level at the collective where they are in contradiction with their existing societies. And then likewise, there's an issue on how media presents information when it comes to environmentalism. So Marxism would take the position of an economic proletariat, whereas post-structuralists would tend to perhaps take the sense of meaning, objectivity, non-objectivity, and various different methodologies of approaching the same problem of environmentalism. So there's, of course, a recognition of a strong environmentalist stream within the tradition of Marxism, humanity, nature. Postmodern efforts to examine power, language, sense of meaning, question concept of the human. So again, this is going to change the idea of the way in which you can be mated to nature. One of the theses that you get in Derrida, for example, is the idea of divine animality. So again, divine but animal. So this is a different kind of materialist divine entity, which is unified with nature. And so, you know, if people can reflect the animal's relationship to nature, then they in turn become more akin to what is deemed, you know, the right method of the right way in which to move. That's in Derrida's Beast and the Sovereign. So you can, but the postmodern and the post-structuralist drive takes more of a linguistic, so that's down to the level of words, statements, sentences, the way that language is used, syntax, and so on and so forth, and then how things like power and identity and sense of meaning are reflected in each of these, and then how all of those can be dialectically reformed, but integrating in now environmentalist ideas. So a form of Marxism which seems to be emerging from the response of Marxists to the failure of the Soviet Union and to radical environmentalists transcend the binary distinction between humanity and nature. So again, this is just looking at one level of analysis, humanity and nature. What you're now coming to is that monad that's at the end of Marx's system. Obviously, if you've read Marx's original ideas, you would know that that's actually the goal of the system. So I don't know why he's positing that this is something new. What is needed is a new postmodernism which not only negates the cultural forms of modernity, but which can replace these forms. So again, we see this kind of coming full circle. Post-structuralism, postmodernism is a dialectical phase. It breaks things apart. Now, having broken all these things apart, a new meta-narrative needs to be constructed. This is just on a high, very grand level, breaking apart a host, an immense number of associations through lots of dialectical investigation, and to fragment things, absolutely find all the contradictions, and then to be able to start assembling these back into the ways in which all of these different aspects can have their antitheses established and then synthetically brought together. So you shatter the piece of glass, and then you synthetically rearrange it in a new form. So that's how you get to the idea of, okay, you've gone from Marxism to neo-Marxism, which reforms Marxist ideas, but with culture and knowledge and all these language and different aspects. You get post-structuralism, which radicalizes these ideas even further. And then, you know, once you've destroyed everything, there's only so much you can do. So instead, you now begin to reconstruct items in a different way. And so, you know, once you've failed at one point to manipulate the entire world into murdering one another, you need to find an alternative route. And so you need to break apart things more locally, more comprehensively, find out what things worked, what things didn't, and then to use those to your advantage. So crystallize a new post-European civilization, environmentalist form of nationalism. This is very interesting. So again, that obviously in some sense alludes to, or could potentially allude to, the European Union, because you know the European Union has the potential to top-down imposition of power, negate the authority of what would then be the provinces. So formerly, you know, formerly what were known as the nations of France and Germany, and so on and so forth. You know, the highest authority is now the what are they called? The commissioners, or whatever they're called. But to, you know, you can move beyond statehood by going into this macro state, so the European Union, but likewise moving past things like the culture, the type of globalist bourgeoisie, you want a globalist proletariat, the form of morals, again with the degradation of religion, so on and so forth. But the idea of an environmentalist form of nationalism I find extremely interesting. It's only by going back into some of Engels' later and midlife works that you can see a number of his comments on the direction in which, or the way in which, the revolution would progress. And what was stark in one of his essays, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's when some revolutionary movements have started to be established. I think it was in France and in Hungary, and against the Hungarians, the Russians were fighting. More broadly, the Slavs were fighting against them. And what was interesting is that the way Engels is talking about how the revolution manifests itself is it kind of, like the seed grows into a sapling and then a tree, it pops up in certain areas. So there's almost this kind of revolutionary spirit which grips a certain people. And it was very interesting because he was talking about how it was the Magyar people, so the Hungarians, at that period in time, who had decided that they who had become the revolutionary force, and by becoming the revolutionary force, anyone who resisted them instantly becomes counter-revolutionary. Now, the interesting idea of the Magyars, the Hungarians, being the people who have essentially bestowed upon themselves the mantle to transform reality and all of human nature, is that it's located at a particular level. It's not a universalist movement. It's a particular movement which is going to break into the universal and spread the universal elsewhere. But other particular nations are against this. So you essentially have this kind of it's a nationalism which is aiming towards universalism. And so I found that statement very interesting in terms of the ideas that are contained within it, because you've almost got aspects of National Socialism latent in Engels in that essay, which is very interesting. And here you've kind of starting to get something which is bending a little bit the way. Nationalism is rooted in a nationhood, but environmentalism, if you're really going to talk about it for the whole, there's a national level in which you can manifest it, but ultimately it's a universalist principle. So it's the union of those two ideas in a very subtle fashion. So succeed through the development of strong nation states committed to subordinating the operations of the market to politically defined ends. Again, that could be a copy and paste from Barry Commoner, so nothing new there. Ecological nationalism should be identified with the struggle for democratic control over the financial institutions, manufacturing and agribusiness. So likewise, if you're always going to impose top-down your horrendous, miserable, totalitarian system, which you've come up sitting in a chair in front of a desk surrounded by books, but without really touching anything or making anything in reality, then the best things that you need are to control people's ability to make transactions and get paid, the things and places where they work, and their ability to feed themselves and to drink water. So that's the totalitarian aspect right there. You need to control every aspect of human life in order to enforce the ecological nationalism for whatever values that happen to be dialectically of utility at that time. So that could be anything. So formulate policies to reduce the power of shareholders in companies relative to stakeholders as the first stage towards decentralization and democratization of industry. This I'm going to explore in the following videos a bit more in depth, and it's a very important idea. The idea being, or the effort being, to drive top down through state power, policies, legislation, restrictions on behaviour, so on and so forth, which are going to change fundamentally the companies and the norms of trade. And the shift is one from shareholders, so the people who've invested in and who've put the money into the company to buy the goods and the hardware and to pay the people, to then create products which can be sold to generate money once again. But moving to stakeholders, stakeholder broadly is the society, it's the collective around it, it's the social. And that's recognised to be one of the dialectical steps in decentralisation. So that's decentralisation of control of a company, but also decentralisation into the democratic collective. So you've got to remember that when you're in Marxism, democratisation does not mean it doesn't mean everybody having choice and then exercising that choice. It means the revolutionary society possessing unimpeded and total control of a certain something, insofar that it can then be capable of exerting its will on that thing. So you've got that Rousseauian aspect of the sovereign collective, which converses with itself and generates a collective will which is used to reform society around it. So you've got that movement. That's what the democratization of industry means. It's get rid of the shareholders and move it more towards the communist. So this requires the development of a social science which subordinates abstract analyses to narrative. So science, I mean, this comes straight out of Hegel. So this is the physical sciences should be subjected to a science of self, or a science of consciousness. So when you're reading Hegel's phenomenology of consciousness, he bemoans the advances of the physical sciences, what they've the kinds of developments they've led to. He describes maths as defective cognition. So that's the kind of, that's the kind of way that the mystics and the Gnostics and the environmentalists here and the dialecticians and so on and so forth happen to think. So the problem, of course, with things like maths and physical sciences is that you need to be fairly well rooted in reality for these systems to work, because they're actually the real reflections of reality. Of course, if you're going to deceive people, you tell people that those things are false reflections and you need to get past them. So what you do is you get round objective reality and try and manipulate everyone into holding the same view so that they can all hold the same language, speak as one, and construct the Tower of Babel. So here what you have is that prior or superior to sciences, you need to have the narrative. So of course you're going to need a meta-narrative, common thing, common hymn shit that people are singing from, in order to subject all the ideas, people's consciousness, what kind of things scientists would study, what kind of data they would look for, what they would kind of shout about. It's the narrative which drives this, and then the narrative drives the science, not the other way around. So preloaded notions, conceptions and emotions dictate the direction of the science. So the conception of humanity, ... be open to revision. So much wrong with that sentence, hard to decide where to begin. If you collapse the distinction, as Derrida does, between humans and animals, what that allowed him to argue was to disregard morality. So that's one of the problems with it. Of course, if you've got the dialectical ideas and Gnostic ideas of sexual creative union, then that same collapse of distinction between humans and animals is not good. If you deny humanity, I mean, are you just killing beasts? I mean, that revision opens up so many problems. It's one of those Pandora box problems. You just don't open it and avoid those problems, because given Marxists' penchant for murdering people in droves, it's not the kind of thing that you want to just allow to happen and lightly. Subordinate to history. So again, that's historicism as the concept. So ultimately subordinate science and ideas and methodologies and so on and so forth to historicism. That necessarily implies a telos to history. That in turn implies the dialectical methodology. So environmentalism should spearhead the attack. That's quite clear. It's emotive. There's a lot of advantages to using something which people would have. People behaving reasonably towards a potential issue in society, how you can use that and abuse their goodwill, and perhaps not looking into the ideas surrounding the movement too deeply, and then you abuse those things and you establish a totalitarian system which then exerts itself on them completely in perpetuity. And then strive to create an image of the future as the triumph of life, a new grand narrative. So, okay, that's the utopian goal. So environmentalism is through anti-utopia, the threat of extinction, to then construct a pathway to the complete opposite, which is, and so that's anti-utopia is the antithesis of utopia. So if you dialectically unite those, you can try and get something at there. So the grand narrative should reflect the diversity of material relations, different group aspects, all of the different aspects that have been built together by the post-structuralists. Of course, if we're thinking back to Barry Commoner, then environmentalism spearheading the attack is the youth who have been given the current dialectical science which governs the which facts are extracted from scientific science and used in relation to environmentalism. So you control the information. So you would expect to see extreme propaganda, loads of information in culture, so on and so forth. All of these used to structure people's consciousness in order to alter their perceptions, the things that they attend to, because the valency of certain information is changed. You look at certain information that, and likewise your morals are structured because you've got this new threat, and also the morality is goal-oriented. All of these things bolt together, and then you teach it to the youth, and they implement one stage, and then they in turn train the next generation, and so on and so forth, and then it dialectically advances. So in part one, we looked at the equation of woman to nature. So this is feminism and ecology, changing the categorization of the two, and then their relation to the oppressor. So of course there's the Judeo-Christian system which underpins marriage, monogamy. So that's the ultimate moral trespass against woman, ultimately now against also nature and environmentalism. So you again depose these things and yada yada yada, so on. So you've also got the integration of explicit religious ideas now into the ecofeminist movement. That's something that you can read later on. There's loads of books. If you just go on and you type in ecofeminism and Gaia, or ecofeminism and water deities or pagan goddesses or whatever, there's going to be there's going to be an absolute plethora of stuff for you to dig your teeth into if you're interested in such stuff. But what's useful about the movement is how there's now the explicit recognition that there needs to be a dialectical union between whatever things they've got going on and some forms of religion. And it's nice to see, essentially at this point, through their dialectical developments, it's taken them a few years to get there, but for them to get round to the same ideas that I've been talking about through Marx and his monism. So there's the union of utopianism and ecology. That's one of the things that resurfaces. And of course, if you've got these ideas which are detached from reality, which you can perfect the world, you can perfect people, and to have them in perfect balance and harmony with one another in the material world, you're obviously going to need to use incredible force to impose that, but ultimately, because it's an impossibility, you're going to harm an immense number of people in pursuit of a goal which cannot be achieved. So it's something that doesn't need to be done, but the academics and the Marxists here they'll still take a crack. Part two is movement through the things that have been generated and split apart and investigated by post-structuralism, and the requirement to establish a new grand narrative. And so there's environmentalism, nationalism, superseding states, and then macro-state, multi-state entities, all of these are, of course, if you're looking at it through a Sartrean lens, it's quite useful because you're taking all of these different aspects of the world, people's legislative systems, their regulatory systems, international treaties and policies, agreements, and how all of these different things dialectically are spiraling, and they're all coming up to this kind of convergence point where everything is integrated into a more or everything can be brought into a stage where it can be integrated into a more holistic worldview. And then we've got these ideas of democratizing business, so that's collapsing the distinction between businesses and then the state. So once you start to get this explicit fascist thread that you could read in Giovanni Gentili's neo-Hegelian system of Italian fascism, which again I'd encourage you to go read, then you really see the kind of the holistic aspects coming down, breaking down all of the contradictions in the old society, making everything reformable. So you also see a substantial effort to get lived experience into discourses. Now, of course, part of that could be representing your lived experience of the suffering of Gaia and environmentalism, and how pollution is an existential horror which technology cannot fix. That's a discourse that we could construct easily from what we've read, what we've talked about. That can all be constructed and then just imposed and used to govern what kind of science can be done, or what is categorized as science and what is categorized as science. And it also means that there's a aspect to the social conversation. Once you reject objective truth being related to environmentalism, then it's just the claim of environmentalism, and it's just the claim of ecological destruction. It's just the claim of Armageddon and anti-utopia. But these no longer need to be based on scientific facts or information or data. They're discourses which guide people's behaviour. Ultimately, when we come to the totalitarian, it's the lived experience of fear of the future, my not controlling things totally in order to know my future uncertainty, and because that situation is unbearable, organising into a collective to obtain political power, reject any kind of delimitation of power in order to affect any kind of policies, legislation and goals desired. And of course, when the fear is for something which is unknown, but which is positioned as existential, which essentially means your own death, then it's the power to do anything. So ultimately, environmentalism is an excellent and likely pathway back to complete totalitarianism. And of course, when we recognise the religious aspects which underpin Marxist methodology and ideas, and the aspect that you can dialectically reform people. So there's the aspect, and then there's also at least under Marxism, there was the requirement for violence. There's a requirement for human sacrifice in order to constitute the material divinity. Here it's not so clear that there's necessarily an aggressive, violent aspect which is required to constitute materialist divinity, but it can manifest itself as seen as a necessary action in order to avoid your own death, or ultimately as a self-defense of nature once you collapse the distinction between humanity and nature, or in defense of animals if you collapse the distinction between the revolutionary collective and animals. So again, lots of pathways by which it can go horribly wrong. That's why you don't teach people to be emotive and unreasonable and to be detached from reality. Okay. These are the works cited. Thank you.